Welcome to session one of History 2 of the History of Popular Music. This class covers music from 1960 up until today. The reason for the break between History 1 and History 2 in 1960 is obvious to anyone who took History 1, but let's revisit it a little bit. The first generation of rock and rollers have either died, retired, or disappeared from the scene, leaving a kind of void, right? Some of them literally died. Eddie Cochran, Buddy Holly. Some of them have left the scene. Little Richard retires to rejoin the ministry. Elvis, in part as a strategy to cool down his career so it doesn't burn out, has gone into the army, and I believe he left in 1958 and is gone for a little bit. And then Chuck Berry's put in jail, and other people have retired because of car accidents, like Carl Perkins and so on, or semi-retired. So there's a void at this point in the scene. In that first generation, Jerry Lee Lewis is disgraced, right, because he was found out to have married his very young teenage cousin. There's a void left then. And it's a void that comes just as the major record companies are beginning to invest in rock and roll, right? So now there's a need, there's a market for it. And not only is there a need for the market, but there's a need for these businesses that are investing money and that want to recoup their output. And this first generation, which is thought of as being somewhat rebellious, somewhat dangerous, I would say slight rebellion, right? I don't want to over exaggerate, as I think is often the case, that people exaggerate the efficacy or the actual rebellious nature of this music. But that first generation has left the scene. And so the record companies are looking for a way to fill the void. And what they do is they find palatable, easily digested forms of music that have elements of rock and roll, that keep the backbeat, for instance, that keep certain elements of the vocal performance, but tone it down a bit, right? Make it into something that is still centered on youth culture. Keep in mind that people like Chuck Berry, he's quite a bit older, even though he's popular with young people. He's quite a bit older, but now these record companies, they're going to look for very young artists. They don't have to be particularly accomplished artists. They don't have to be great singers. They have to look good. They have to have a certain charisma, and they have to gain audiences, right? Youthful audiences that are going to invest in this music, going to pay for the music, make it an event on television, make it an event at live performances. So this period from 1960 to 63, when the Beatles come in and when we move from rock, we can call this period still rock and roll, but it's a kind of watered down rock and roll. It's a populist rock and roll, or better yet, populist makes it sound in a way like it's coming up from a grassroots situation, and it's not really. It's a top-down model. It's the corporations investing in and then creating something that they think is going to be popular, that they can sell. Now, one of the central testing grounds, if you will, as well as disseminators of the popular in this period, is the TV show American Bandstand. This is a music performance and dance program. Notice performance here is in scare quotes, right? For and featuring teens dancing. It started in 1952, and then Dick Clark, the more famous director and MC of American Bandstand, he took over in 1956. It lasted under his direction until 1989, so quite a long-standing television show. Teens danced to top 40 music, and keep in mind that what we're talking about here is still prior to 1991, right? In 1991, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, the SoundScan, the Nielsen SoundScan era begins. And what that means is the rankings of what's selling the best, at least within retail stores, becomes much more accurate. So at this time, what constitutes the top 40 has to do with calling DJs, and obviously not calling all the DJs, just having some of them report on what they're playing, looking at what's included in jukeboxes, but again, it's selective reporting, and even the reports from the record stores, those are voluntary reports by the record store owners, and not all of them, some of them. right? So it's a very skewed notion of what the actual top 40 is, and that allows for a great deal of manipulation, and Bandstand participates in that manipulation. Just because they say it's in the top 40, you can ask yourself by what measure. The easy thing to do here is to take a look at top 40 lists from American Bandstand, from Billboard, from Your Hit Parade, and compare them. Do they match up? Are they the same top 40? And there will be some things that are very similar. Most things will be very similar, but they will have some discrepancies, and a song might appear in one that doesn't appear in the others. So it allows for a great deal of manipulation. And I talk about this a bit in the payola episode of the podcast that you should be listening to for this session as well. Now, usually during American Bandstand, one guest artist would appear to lip sync to a song. That's why I called it quote unquote performance, right? So Freddie Cannon, for instance, he made the most appearances. He appeared 110 times. But many different artists and groups performed. The show's format inspired later dance and music shows like Soul Music and Top of the Pops, right? So this format becomes very influential. And it comes to prominence really under the direction of this man. This is, of course, Dick Clark. The show began as a local program, just called Bandstand, on Philadelphia TV show WFIL Channel 6, and was hosted by DJ Bob Will as an extension of his eponymous radio show. Eponymous just means of the same name, so it was also called Bandstand. This version mostly showed short musical films. So kind of like Soundies, an early version of the music video. And we talked about Soundies last semester. They're just short films with music performances or sometimes acted out scenes set to the music. They're just a single song, like a music video, right? But they would show them on video jukeboxes or in movie theaters. And now they're showing them on this show, Bandstand, just a local show, a local Philadelphia show. On October 7th of 1952, Horn changes the format, though, to teens dancing to records. And at first, the executives at the television station, they're not so sure people are going to want to watch this, but he's convinced it will be popular, right? And someone who's even more convinced is Dick Clark, who becomes the host in 1956 when Horn is fired owing to a drunk driving incident. And what Dick Clark does is he pitches the show to ABC to go national, so that it's not just a local show, it'll be broadcast throughout the nation. They didn't want to do it at first. He had to convince them that actually this is not a niche kind of show. It's not a show where a few people are going to watch to see their friends dance. Because that was the sort of common wisdom. That of course people from Philadelphia are tuning in because maybe they'll see their friend or their neighbor dancing on there. And that'll be fun for them. Right? He says no. Teens will want to watch it because they'll want to watch other people doing dances to see how they match up, to learn new dances, and to feel like you're participating in a kind of zeitgeist, a kind of cultural moment, youth culture, right? On the other hand, he says, and this was the important part of the pitch, adults are going to want to watch it as well, because they're going to indulge in a certain kind of nostalgia when they were young, and they would go to sock hops and dance with their friends, and be free and not burdened by all of their responsibilities and the demands upon them. And that means that the music had to be picked to be sort of a kind of special kind of music. It had to appeal broadly. It couldn't be alienating in the way that the first generation of rock and rollers were to the adult market. It had to be something that was more accessible. It had to include elements of rock and roll because it had to still be youthful. It had to feel like it's still new. But at the same time, it could bring in more Tin Pan Alley, more pop music approaches to form and to expression and to melody. And that all had to be presented by someone who was non-threatening, not like Elvis, at least in the early days. Someone who dressed well, who had a reasonably neat haircut, who seemed like someone you might not mind your teenage daughter dating. And at the same time, it had to be someone that your teenage daughter wouldn't mind dating, right? Which isn't always such an easy combination because the people that the parents don't mind, maybe the daughter would, or the son when we're talking about the female artists, or, at least the standard model here of what's supposed to be attractive. So it debuts as American Bandstand on August 5th, 1957. There were no black teens at this time allowed in the studio other than performers. Now, this is a somewhat controversial point, but it was tested by local newspapers and found that people were kind of weeded out of the lines, right? Now, that changes in 1964 when the show moves to L.A., but by then both black and white teens are allowed into the studio, but by then it's in decline as far as its importance goes. So here are the teen idols. These are the young men that are selling this kind of music. They're young boys packaged as ideal boyfriends. Ideal both for, as I said, both for the kids and for the adults, right? They're well groomed, attractive. Notice they're all wearing suits, right? Polite, sensitive. When they're interviewed on things like Bandstand, they come across as being just a little shy, even though they're super popular. They're in films, right? That's Frankie Avalon all the way to the right, and that's Fabian all the way to the left. They're not only singing on television and on the radio and selling records, they're also on films on a regular basis. The one in the middle toward the right is Bobby Rydell, and then, of course, in the middle toward the left is Dick Clark, who, even though he's a good 10 years older, at least, than all the rest of them, he looks like he fits right in, right? And he's got that boyish look, and he really maintained that throughout much of his life. And while that seems like such a minor point to make about Dick Clark, it was integral to his career. He really embodied, in a lot of ways, the image that he was trying to sell, of a youthful image that's kind of eternally youthful, that can stay there, that it's okay for adults to watch because they can still be youthful too in some way, right? By sticking close to the youth culture, but not a youth culture that's threatening them, not a youth culture that's going to topple that generation, but one that is in this sort of state of almost Rousseauian freedom, right? They don't have responsibilities. They're just living life, and the adults can watch that and get this kind of wellspring of energy from it. Now, many of these idols, like Fabian, for instance, he couldn't really sing, but that wasn't what was important. What was important was the image, right? When you're singing in a studio, you can do it over and over again. You can even have someone else do it or do parts of it, right? Until it's just right. He's never going to sing live. He's always going to be lip syncing. So it doesn't really matter that he can't sing that well. And so here he is. In some ways, the most typical or prototypical, the one of the most interesting in some ways, idol is Fabian. He was discovered in 1957 by Bob Marcucci and Peter DeAngelis. Bob Marcucci is, of course, one of the most important record producers of that period. He's the owner, they're both owners of Chancellor Records, operating out of Philadelphia. And what they were doing is they're scouring South Philly neighborhoods, searching for teens with good looks. Literally, that's what they're doing. They're not holding singing auditions. They're not even doing their own version of a kind of American Idol where you let anyone come in and just let's see if they have some talent. They're just looking for people who look good. Marcucci knew Fabian's next door neighbor, and he saw Fabian on a rather unfortunate day. This was the day when Fabian's father was taken away by an ambulance following a heart attack. Marcucci approaches Fabian that very day. Keep this in mind, right? Fabian just watched his father being carried off in an ambulance. He doesn't know whether his father's going to live or die. His father's certainly going to be out of work for a while. He's suffered a pretty severe cardiac arrest. And here's this guy that he's never met, a friend of the neighbors, coming over and saying, hey, how would you like to, record some songs? Fabian's like, I don't sing. Why are you bothering me right now? Right? Fabian was clearly worried about his father, and he rebuffed the advance. He said, no, I'm not interested. But after the heart attack, his father couldn't find work. He was having a lot of trouble. He had to recover, and he couldn't do whatever his job was prior to that. So the family agrees to Marcucci's offer, despite the fact that Fabian really can't sing. He simply had the right look. He lip-synced at one of Dick Clark's record hops, and the girls went crazy for him. And Dick Clark said to Marcucci, you got a hit. He's a star. Now all you have to do is teach him to sing. Because Dick Clark knew he couldn't sing. Everyone knew he couldn't sing. Fabian had 2 top 40 hits written by Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann, and we'll talk about them a little more in a bit. I'm a Man and Turn Me Loose. Turn Me Loose was a huge hit. That was a pop number 9 in 1959. And he appears several times on American Bandstand, and you can hear people going crazy for him, right? He's also in a series of movies, some of them beach-related movies, just like Frankie Avalon before him. And this becomes a huge part of this cultural moment of rock and roll in this kind of anodyne marketing era. Here's some more of the idols. There's Bobby Rydell again, and Frankie Avalon in the lower right corner. Then you have Neil Sedaka over there at the bottom left, right? And then Paul Anka up at the top right. Philadelphia, because of American Bandstand, was a major source of these teen idols, right? I mean, after all, the idea is that they're supposed to be ready for television, they're supposed to look good on television, then why not have them right there where we can test them on American Bandstand without having to fly them across the country or anything else, right? So Philadelphia becomes a huge source of these American idols, of these youth idols, and so all of these guys come from this era. You have Fabian, you have Frankie Avalon, Bobby Rydell, Freddie Cannon, etc. Now, a few of the idols even wrote their own songs. So Neil Sedaka, the guy up in the upper right, he wrote Breaking Up Is Hard to Do, which was a pop number 1 and an R&B 12 in 1962. Bobby Darin wrote Dream Lover in 1959. That was a pop 2, R&B 4. And then Paul Anka, the fellow over at the bottom left, wrote Diana, which was a pop 1 and R&B number 1 in 1957. So notice that what we're talking about here, some of these songs are before 1960. And they're already sort of working out. This is the major labels trying to get into the rock and roll business, and that's what's going to carry on from 1960 to 63, with the exception, of course, of Motown. But even Motown follows this model to some extent, and we'll talk about that soon enough. Now, the twist phenomenon, another thing related directly to American Bandstand. The twist first appeared as a B-side to the song Teardrops on Your Letter by Hank Ballard and the Midnighters. That was in 1959, and it was on the King label, which is a independent label, a small label. And that, we'll see a picture in just a moment of Hank Ballard. The dance associated with the song gained some traction with youthful black teens, and then therefore, as often happens, white teens become interested in what black teens are doing and start emulating it. And so Dick Clark notices that people are doing the twist on his radio or on his television show. And becomes interested in the dance, right? Now, this version, the Hank Ballard version, peaks at 28, at number 28 on the Billboard Hot 100. The Philly-based Parkway label, which had access to American Bandstand, and listen to the Paola episode of the podcast to hear more about these various forms of access. This label had Chubby Checker redo the record. Now, the story goes that basically Dick Clark just wanted to find records that kids could do the twist to, and he thought that Hank Ballard's, which by this point is less than a year old, was worn out, and then he wanted someone else to do it. And he said, well, if we can't have them do some other song, let's just do that version. But he doesn't want to use the Hank Ballard. Now, you got to ask yourself why. Right? Some people might tell you he doesn't want to use it because it's not that accessible. But they're so close in style that when Hank Ballard first heard the song on the radio, he thought it was him. He thought, oh my God, I'm on white radio. Right? I've made it. But it wasn't him. It was Chubby Checker doing a Hank Ballard impersonation. So why did Dick Clark want to redo it? The reason's obvious. He had his fingers in it. He was getting money from the new version. He didn't have any right to get any money from the Hank Ballard version, but he's considered a consultant or whatever with the arrangement of the Chuck Berry, the arrangement being basically no different from the Hank Ballard. So it's a way for him to make money. And of course he's going to make money because he's going to play it on American Bandstand all the time. So it has Chubby Checker on it, and that's Chubby Checker, of course, is a reworking of the name Fats Domino in essence. And he records it in 1960, and it becomes the number one pop song, and then number one again roughly a year later. It's one of the few, if not the only songs, to chart twice at number one, non-consecutively. So in other words, not 1 week after the other, but where there was a break where it was off the charts and then it comes back. It was the only song to have two separate appearances at number one. Now, the second one was fueled by the adult twist sensation at the Peppermint Lounge in New York City. Checker sounded so much like Ballard, like I said, that Ballard himself thought that it was he singing the song, that was him on the song on white radio, and thought that he had made it into the big time, but it was Chubby Checker. There's Hank Ballard and there's Chubby Checker. Now, of course, Hank Ballard got residuals. He got the licensing fee for them to use the song, but the big money is selling the actual version of the song, and that went to Chubby Checker, and it went to Dick Clark, and it went to Parkway. It went to those entities rather than Hank Ballard. So the twist itself, it's a very simple solo dance, although you can do it in front of someone else. You're not touching them, right? But it involves swiveling of the hips. Now, when you watch interviews with Chubby Checker, he'll make it seem like this was the most radical thing ever because you're moving your hips. Every dance from the U.S., at least since the ragtime era, involves moving the hips to some extent, right? And this isn't any particularly threatening type of dance. So Chubby Checker's wrong. What makes it popular is that it's something anyone can do. It's not a very fancy dance. It doesn't have a lot of moves to it. So even as you can see here, the most sort of button down of the button down can do this dance, and they did at places like the Peppermint Lounge. These two photos are from the Peppermint Lounge. And it launches a series of these social rock and roll dances like the mashed potato, the pony, the monkey, the swim, the jerk, the watusi, the limbo. And they're centered on a bunch of new discotheques, a bunch of new clubs where you can do these dances, both adults and young people, right? So again, notice there's not the same kind of separation of the generations that we had in the late 50s. There's more of a sense of the youth are setting the fads, and then the adults come into it. Now, another thing that the twist inspired was go-go dancers, right? This whole dance phenomenon launched the go-go dancer phenomenon. And so you can see, girls dancing in elevated cages, like you see at the bottom left there and upper left. Sometimes in not too revealing of clothing, but fairly revealing for the early 60s, right? As you can see in the bottom right. And then the sort of classic look with the striped shirt, V-neck more or less shirt, and then the skirt. And the skirt, of course, is designed to be relatively short, but still plume out when you turn around and so on. And there were a series of dance songs of this era. That's Twist again, right? Chubby Checker basically just puts out one twist song after another. That's why if you're really up on this period of music history, you might be able to list 3, maybe 4 tunes, and they all have twist in the title or refer to twisting in some fashion. Then there were other dance craze songs like The Locomotion, At the Hop, and so on. A very important place in New York City for the dissemination and creation of this kind of music, this youth-inspired music, was the Brill Building, right, which is at 1650 Broadway. And this is a photograph, a fairly recent photograph. So it still looks like this. It doesn't operate with the same businesses anymore, but you can go see it, and that's what it looks like. It housed Al Don Music, which was run by Al Nevins and Don Kirshner. So notice Al Don comes from their two first names. And this is very typical of these business names at this time. We'll see it also with Motown. It was founded in 1958, so right as rock and roll is being bought up by the major record companies. It's a publishing house based on the Tin Pan Alley model of songwriting teams. So you have a bunch of songwriting teams, a lyricist and a musician who are working together to create these little hit songs, right? And you have Carole King and Jerry Goffin. They're a married couple that are one of the more celebrated of these teams, and we'll talk about them in more detail in a moment. Cynthia Weil and Barry Mann, Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann. We've already mentioned them a moment ago because they wrote some songs for Fabian. Lieber and Stoller, of course, whom we know from last semester. In some ways, they're the model for all this, the independent song producers. And again, we'll return to them in a moment. Neil Sedaka and Howard Greenfield. Other writers included Paul Simon, Ellie Greenwich, Phil Spector, Burt Bacharach, and Neil Diamond, right? So a huge number of these performers. Even Lou Reed was at the Brill Building for a little bit, not for terribly long, but he was a songwriter at the Brill Building. There were several labels either associated with the Brill Building or with offices in the Brill Building. And this sound of the Brill Building, it really dominates the charts for a while between 1958 until 1964 with the British invasion, along with Motown. Once a song was selected, a producer organized a session with studio musicians and singing artists, and several of these labels would have been open to them, right? So you have Bang Records, of course you have Aldon Music publishing there, Just Sunshine, Juan Records, Buddha Records, Scepter Records, and so on. So these are all important record labels with offices right there in the Brill Building or closely associated with Aldon Music in some way. One of the models for this was Lieber and Stoller's hit "There Goes My Baby," sung by the Drifters with Benny King. Now, the Drifters were one of the doo-wop groups. They were falling apart at the end of the 50s, and Lieber and Stoller basically decided they would take over their career. They would be their producers for a short period of time, bring them back to prominence. And what they did is they got one of their favorite singers, Benny King, who's the second in from the left. That's Benny King. Brilliant voice. Just an amazing voice, as you know if you've ever heard the song "Stand By Me." And he often has his voice drenched in that reverb that's so typical of the late 50s and early 60s. And they had a pop number 2, R&B number 1 hit in 1959 with the song "There Goes My Baby." Now, this is an important early model for the Brill Building style. It was produced by Lieber and Stoller for Atlantic Records. But the thing, we talked about them last semester. Let me remind you very briefly. Lieber and Stoller are two white songwriters and record producers. And at first they have a contract with Atlantic, but they renegotiate the contract where they are now independent producers. So they will bring things to Atlantic Records, but they don't have to. They can work for any record company they wish to work for, right? And still have an association with Atlantic Records. It's the first time anyone's had a contract like that. And it really creates a role that wasn't around before. Right, so this is in a sense the rise of the producers in popular music, especially rock and roll oriented music. Now, this was a major departure for both Atlantic, the song, and for the typical manner of recording R&B acts. Because usually when you had, on Atlantic, when you had the R&B acts, they might have guitar and drums and bass, maybe some horns, but it was really focused on just the voices. And it was a grittier sound, right? But this song, and listen to it very carefully, this song is all about the string arrangement. It's all about the big sound. It has strong production values. A dense string arrangement by Stan Applebaum. The violins play saxophone-like runs throughout, thus creating a hybrid between rock and roll and pop. You have the high gospel style vocals by Benny King, who co-wrote the song. The kind of free-form poetry instead of the typical rhyming couplets. I mean, read the lyrics; they don't rhyme, right? And really, the form itself is very interesting. Because it doesn't have the verse-chorus structure. It's really just chorus, a sort of verse, back to chorus, and then the rest of the whole song is outro. It's just one long outro. It has a Latin rhythm in the timpani, and then doo-wop background vocals, and a deep reverb on the entire recording. And it sounds dense and big. Phil Spector plays guitar on these sessions, and this is where he learns his idea or develops his idea of the wall of sound. He really just learns the approach from them, as we'll see. So let's talk at least about one of these Brill Building songwriting teams. Here's Jerry Goffin and Carole King. They were a married couple, and they were a songwriting team. Jerry Goffin wrote the lyrics, and Carole King wrote the music. Most of the songs were uncontroversial. They were little pop hits, right? They literally wrote songs for like their babysitter, right? I think Locomotion was for the babysitter, right? They thought she had a cute kind of squeaky voice. She wasn't a singer. She was just literally their babysitter. And they're like, well, why don't you come record it, right? So there she is. She's got a hit. They wrote some controversial songs, not too many, but there are a couple of exceptions. Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow by the Shirelles, which was a huge hit, pop #1, R&B #1 in 1960, right? But it's about a one-night stand, basically, and the woman wondering if the guy's still going to want to be with her after this, right? And then they also wrote the song He Hit Me and It Felt Like a Kiss, which was recorded by the Crystals, which is obviously about domestic abuse. Only a few of the artists at the Brill Building in general had an actual standing or reputation. Most of these artists were interchangeable. Like I said, you have the babysitter, and she's going to have a hit or maybe two, and then you're done. It doesn't matter. You're not trying to cultivate artists' careers here. The emphasis is on the song and on the writing team behind the song. The artists are largely interchangeable. The exception, of course, is the Righteous Brothers. And so you had these girl groups, more or less interchangeable, right? You have the Crystals. The Crystals are the four at the bottom that are standing in a line, with in a straight row. You have the Shirelles. They're all the way to the left there. The Ronettes up above. You also have the Dixie Cups. That's in between the Shirelles and the Crystals, and then all the way over to the right is the Chiffons with songs like He's So Fine, right? And One Fine Day. Now, these groups were mostly black, as you can see here. There were others, like the Angels, who were white. They were largely interchangeable, according to the whims of the producers. So, for instance, the Crystals, like I said, they're the ones where you can see their full bodies there. That's just one of many pictures of them. And when you take a careful look at the various pictures, they're not usually the same people, right? Even the lead singer is different from song to song. There's no stable group there, right? The Ronettes are a little more stable. The Shirelles, not so much. They were changed in and out, and the Chiffons and so on. It's really just grabbing singers that you have in your stable, your roster of singers, and saying, here's a group. Why bother? Well, because that way you can put out a whole bunch of songs by a producer or songwriting team and say, well, these are songs by the Chiffons, even though the singers are different on each one, because what's important is the song for them, not the performing group. Again, they're not trying to foster the careers of artists. So different singers are moved in and out of groups, and sometimes the girls are on tour. The girls that go on tour, the singers that go on tour, are different from those in the studio, and so on. So this is industry-driven music. The performers have no real power. Now, you have some hits and some more writers, right? So several famous hits by Brill Building girl groups include Soldier Boy, a pop #1, R&B #3 in 1962. The Shirelles, He's a Rebel, pop 1, R&B 2. The Crystals, He's So Fine, 63, pop 1, R&B #1. Chiffons, My Boyfriend's Back, that was a big one, 1963, pop 1, R&B 2. I'm sorry, My Boyfriend's Back by the Angels. He's So Fine is by the Chiffons. So notice the crossover success of these songs. They're on both labels, and that leads, as we'll see in a moment, Billboard magazine to say, well, maybe there's no real distinction anymore between R&B and pop music. So they dropped the distinction for a brief period of time in 1962, or not 1962. Is it 4? We'll see in a moment. We'll see when that was in a moment. But for a brief period of time, there is no distinction between the pop charts and the R&B charts. Now, other teams outside the Brill Building followed suit, right? So you have Jeff Berry and Allie Greenwich at Trio Music, and Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann at Hill and Range Songs. And that's Doc Pomus, the larger gentleman smiling with the beard. And then, of course, Allie Greenwich and Jeff Berry are over to the left. One of the biggest of these producers, though, is Phil Spector, one of the most influential. Along with Lieber and Stoller, he's an early example of the modern record producer. The producer, like the A&R man previously, artists and repertoire man, brought together the performers for a session. But whereas the artist and repertoire man was really interested in fostering careers, The modern producer isn't. The modern producer is in service to the song. He's looking for the hit song that's going to be on the radio, that's going to appeal to the largest amount of people, right? So the modern producer took on more responsibilities and therefore reaped greater financial reward by becoming a specialist in charge of the sound of the recording, the arrangements, the mixing, etc. Phil Spector had his first hit as a performer and songwriter with the Teddy Bears To Know Him Is To Love Him. He wrote that song and he performs guitar on it. It was a R&B number 10 in 58, so not a huge hit, didn't make the pop charts, but it had some purchase on the market. He began to work under Lieber and Stoller. He plays the guitar solo on The Drifters on Broadway. If you know that song, it's kind of a quirky guitar solo, and that's him playing it. But it was as a producer that he really made his impact. He created what he calls the wall of sound. He recorded an enormous group in a small space at Gold Star Studios in LA. And Gold Star Studios is one of his favorite studios, right? In part because he felt that it had an inimitable echo. It had this echo that you had to, as he puts it, you had to treat it just right. You had to arrange the instruments in such a way that it would maximize the use of that echo as opposed to it becoming something that interferes with the clarity of the recording. And he would mic the room so that there was no isolation. Isolation in the early 60s is still pretty rare, right? He has some sort of, let's call it leaking isolation, where he keeps the instruments separate. It's not like they're all hovering around a few group mics, but their mics bleed, right? So that overdubs are not a concern at this time. They're not using overdubs. So they're getting more or less live performances that they're layering on top of each other, right? So he would mix it all down to a monophonic track. So this all becomes track one, right? He also emphasized doubling in his arrangements, so that, for instance, the bass line would be doubled by a cello, or a certain guitar line would be doubled by pizzicato violins, or whatever. He doubles a lot of his instruments, and of course he has heavy reverb in his mixes, and then the echo from the recording itself. So all that gets to be track one, this huge instrumental track. Then he puts vocals on track 2 and strings on track 3, and he mixes it all down to a monophonic track. Why monophonic? Because he believes you can get stereo at this time recordings, and eventually he will, but he thinks that it gives it more reverberation, and also the car radios are not stereo at this time. They're monophonic, right? So he wants it to sound as good as it can possibly sound on the car stereo, because he thinks young people are driving around listening to this music, and that's what's going to get them to buy it, right? He thought of these as teenage symphonies. So he thinks of each of these as 3-minute works of art, where the song itself is what's important. It's not the band. It is him to some extent, because it's a kind of efflorescence of his own sounding image. But the idea here is for the song to sell. He, of course, has one of the great studio groups behind him, right? The Wrecking Crew, with drummer Hal Blaine, pianist Leon Russell, bassists Larry Knechtel and Carol Kay, and that's Carol Kay you see there with the headphones on. Barney Kessel, the great jazz guitarist who plays on a bunch of pop hits, right? Tom Tedesco or whatever. You have a whole bunch of really great players there. Hal Blaine's one of the great drummers, as you'll hear when you listen to the Ronettes, Be My Baby. Spector demanded multiple takes. He wanted to get things just right, and his recordings were very expensive to make, right? We're just making these 3-minute songs, but he would spend a lot of money getting it just right, and then he often recouped the money because his songs would be very successful. We mentioned the Righteous Brothers before. Here they are recording. Some of the hits that Phil Spector records include the Crystals' Dadu Run Run, right, of 1963. Then He Kissed Me, another Crystals hit. Then the Ronettes' Be My Baby, which was a Pop 2 R&B number 4 in 63. And you'll read something that I wrote about that and think about that in a bit more detail. And then after the decline of the girl groups in 64 with the beginning of the British invasion, he had another hit along with the writers Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil with the Righteous Brothers, You've Lost That Love and Feeling, which was an R&B number 2 in 1965. It's considered one of the really important records of that period. It's a very long record with a strong musical contrast in the bridge, which was considered a risk because people would lose the sense of the main groove and the hook. So it really is a kind of teenage symphony with almost like two movements within it. And it's a terribly long record with a lot of sort of wailing in the vocals over it. So it feels static in some ways, like the Drifters' There Goes My Baby, but even longer and more epic, if you will. So a good thing to do would be to listen to There Goes My Baby, The Drifters, produced by Lieber and Stoller, and then listen to the Righteous Brothers singing You've Lost That Love and Feeling, written by Man and Weil and produced by Phil Spector. That's it for this session. We'll continue with session 2. See you then.